Every crime scene tells a story, but some stories are too dark to forget. Welcome to Fatal Crime Investigation, where we uncover the truth behind the world's most chilling cases. Subscribe to the channel and join us as we investigate fatal crime stories. On the morning of December 24, 2002, the quiet streets of Modesto, California were preparing for Christmas. Homes were decorated. Families were planning dinners. The calm suburban neighborhood looked exactly the way it should on Christmas Eve. But inside one home on Covina Avenue, something had gone terribly wrong. 27-year-old Laci Peterson, 8 months pregnant with her first child, had disappeared. There were no signs of a struggle. No witnesses. No immediate explanation. Just a silent house and a growing sense that something was very wrong. Her husband, Scott Peterson, told investigators he had spent the morning fishing at the Berkeley Marina, nearly 90 miles away. When he returned home, he said, Laci was gone. At first, it looked like a tragic missing person case. But the longer investigators looked, the stranger the story became. To friends and family, Scott and Laci Peterson looked like a happy young couple. They had met in college. Their relationship had grown quickly, and soon they were married. By 2002, they were preparing to welcome their first child, a boy they planned to name Connor. Friends described Laci as warm, kind, and full of excitement about becoming a mother. Scott, meanwhile, worked as a fertilizer salesman and seemed supportive of their growing family. From the outside, their life appeared peaceful. But detectives would later discover that the reality behind the Peterson marriage was far more complicated than it appeared. And those complications would slowly begin to reshape the investigation. According to Scott, the morning of December 24th began normally. He said Laci was home when he left. She was planning to mop the floors, bake cookies, and take their dog for a walk. Scott said he decided to go fishing that day. Later that morning, a neighbor made a discovery that would become one of the earliest mysteries in the case. The Petersons' dog had been found wandering alone, still wearing its leash. The neighbor returned the dog to the Peterson yard. But Laci was nowhere to be seen. That detail troubled investigators. If Laci had been walking the dog, why was the dog alone? If something had happened outside, why had no one seen anything? And if she had never left the house, what happened before Scott drove away? Within hours, family members began searching. Soon volunteers joined police officers, combing through parks, neighborhoods, and nearby fields. Missing posters appeared across Modesto. Local news stations began reporting the story. Then national media arrived. A young pregnant woman had vanished on Christmas Eve. The case spread across the country almost overnight. But while the public focused on the search for Laci, investigators quietly began examining Scott. They studied his timeline. They reviewed his statements. They analyzed every movement he made that morning. At first, nothing immediately confirmed foul play. But detectives knew that in missing person cases, the smallest detail can change everything. And in this case, one discovery would alter the investigation completely. Weeks after Laci disappeared, investigators uncovered something Scott had not revealed. He had been involved in a relationship with another woman. Her name was Amber Fry. According to Fry, she had no idea Scott was married when they met. To investigators, this was not proof of murder. But it was something else. A secret life. And suddenly the case no longer looked like a simple disappearance. A pregnant wife was missing. A husband had been living a double life. And investigators now had reason to question everything Scott had told them. The story was becoming darker. Not because one piece of evidence solved the mystery, but because many small pieces were beginning to point in the same direction. Months passed with no answers. Then in April 2003, investigators made a devastating discovery. The remains of Laci Peterson and her unborn son Connor were found along the shoreline of the San Francisco Bay. The location stunned investigators, because it was near the same bay where Scott said he had gone fishing on the day Laci disappeared. Shortly afterward, Scott Peterson was arrested and charged with murder. What had once been a missing person investigation had now become one of the most controversial murder cases in American history. The trial of Scott Peterson quickly became a national spectacle. Prosecutors argued that Scott had killed Laci to escape his responsibilities and start a new life. They pointed to his secret relationship, his fishing trip, and the location where the bodies were found. The defense argued something very different. They said the case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. There was no eyewitness to the crime, no confession, no clear forensic evidence explaining exactly what had happened inside the Peterson home. The courtroom became the center of a national debate. Some believed the evidence clearly showed Scott was guilty. Others believed the case left too many unanswered questions. In 2004, Scott Peterson was convicted of murdering Laci and Connor. Years later, his death sentence would be overturned, and he was resentenced to life in prison. For Laci's family, the verdict brought justice. But for many observers, the case never felt fully settled. Even today, more than 2 decades later, the Scott Peterson case continues to spark debate. Because when investigators reconstruct the timeline, certain moments still raise uncomfortable questions. The dog found wandering with its leash. Witness sightings that seemed to conflict with the timeline. Phone calls investigators studied repeatedly. Details that some believe were misunderstood or possibly overlooked. And perhaps the most unsettling question of all: what really happened inside that house on Christmas Eve morning? Did investigators uncover the full truth? Or was the story more complicated than anyone realized? Because when detectives later examined Scott Peterson's phone calls during the investigation, they heard something that changed how they viewed the entire case. A conversation, a lie, and a moment that made investigators wonder whether Scott had already begun preparing for a future without Laci. But those recordings, and what detectives discovered next, would not be revealed until later. And when they were finally heard, they would leave investigators asking a far more disturbing question. Was Scott Peterson simply a husband caught in a tragic situation? Or had he already started telling a completely different story long before Laci ever disappeared? When investigators began examining the case more closely, they realized something important. This was no longer just a missing person investigation. It had become a puzzle, one where every conversation, every movement, and every hidden detail might hold a piece of the truth. And the first major breakthrough came from a source no one had expected. A woman named Amber Frye. When police first contacted Frye, she was stunned. She had been dating Scott Peterson, but according to her, she had no idea he was married. When detectives told her that Scott's pregnant wife, Laci Peterson, had disappeared weeks earlier, the reality of the situation hit her immediately. The man she thought she knew might be connected to one of the most disturbing cases in the country. But instead of walking away from the investigation, Amber Frye made a decision that would dramatically change the course of the case. She agreed to help police. And that decision would lead to something investigators rarely get in a murder investigation. Recorded conversations. Phone calls. Words spoken by Scott Peterson himself. Police asked Amber Frye to continue speaking with Scott, while investigators secretly recorded their conversations. Over the following weeks, Scott made dozens of calls. And what detectives heard in those conversations puzzled them. Scott rarely spoke about searching for his missing wife. Instead, he often spoke about travel, about work, about his daily life. In some calls, he told Amber he was spending the holidays in Paris. But at the same time, investigators knew he was standing only a few hundred feet away from the search for Laci in Modesto. For detectives listening to those recordings, the contrast was disturbing. A nationwide search was underway. Families were pleading for information. Yet Scott's words painted a very different picture. And the deeper investigators looked, the more contradictions they began to see. As the case intensified, every part of Scott Peterson's life was placed under scrutiny. Investigators reviewed bank records, computer searches, and phone logs. They examined his boat. They studied his timeline from the morning of December 24th. Why had he decided to go fishing that day? Why had he traveled nearly 90 miles away? Why had he not told friends or family about the fishing trip beforehand? None of these questions alone proved anything. But together, they created a pattern investigators could not ignore. And as the investigation continued, Scott's behavior drew even more attention. During the weeks following Laci's disappearance, reporters noticed something unusual. Scott sometimes appeared calm, almost detached. For some observers, that behavior seemed suspicious. For others, it meant nothing, because grief does not look the same for everyone. Still, investigators continued building their timeline. And every new detail seemed to deepen the mystery. Then came the moment that changed the entire case. In April 2003, nearly 4 months after Laci disappeared, a discovery was made along the shoreline of San Francisco Bay. First, the remains of an infant were found. Soon after, the remains of an adult woman were discovered nearby. DNA testing would later confirm the devastating truth. They belonged to Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. The discovery shocked the country. But for investigators, one detail stood out immediately: the location. The remains had been found in the same bay where Scott Peterson said he had gone fishing on the day Laci vanished. Within days, Scott Peterson was arrested. The missing person case had officially become a murder case. When the trial began, the entire nation was watching. Prosecutors argued that Scott Peterson had carefully planned the murder of his wife. They suggested he wanted freedom from his marriage, and freedom from the responsibilities of fatherhood. They pointed to the affair with Amber Fry. They pointed to the fishing trip. They pointed to the location where Laci's body had been discovered. But the defense offered a very different argument. They insisted the prosecution's case was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. There was no direct eyewitness, no video recording of the crime, no clear forensic explanation of exactly what happened inside the Peterson home. The courtroom became a battlefield of interpretation. Two narratives, two completely different versions of the same story. And for months, the jury listened to testimony from detectives, experts, and witnesses. In November 2004, the jury reached its decision. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Laci Peterson and second-degree murder in the death of Connor. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. For Laci's family, it marked the end of a long and painful fight for justice. But outside the courtroom, the debate continued. Because even after the conviction, the case continued to divide public opinion. Some believed the evidence clearly proved Scott's guilt. Others believed the case left too many unanswered questions. Over the years, appeals and legal challenges continued. Scott Peterson maintained his innocence. Supporters argued that certain pieces of evidence deserved closer examination. Critics argued the case had already been thoroughly investigated. And so the story refused to disappear. Today, more than 20 years later, the Scott Peterson case remains one of the most discussed true crime stories in America. Because behind the courtroom verdict, the mystery still lingers. What really happened inside that Modesto home on Christmas Eve morning? Did investigators uncover the full truth? Or were there pieces of the puzzle that were never fully understood? Some believe the case is closed. Others believe the story is not finished. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all is that some investigators believe there may still be evidence in the case that has never been fully explored. Evidence that could raise new questions about what happened that day. Questions that could change how the entire story is understood. Because sometimes, the truth in a case like this is not revealed all at once. Sometimes it emerges slowly, piece by piece, long after the courtroom lights have gone dark. And in the case of Scott Peterson, some people believe the final chapter has not yet been written. If new evidence ever surfaces, if hidden details ever come to light, the story of Laci Peterson could once again return to the center of the national conversation. And when that happens, the question that has haunted this case from the beginning will return with it. What really happened on Christmas Eve, inside that quiet house on Covina Avenue? And will the world ever know the full truth? More than 2 decades have passed since that quiet Christmas Eve morning in Modesto, California, the morning when Laci Peterson vanished without a trace. The courtrooms have closed. The verdict has been delivered. And Scott Peterson now lives out the remainder of his life behind prison walls. But for many people who followed the case, the story never truly ended. Because some tragedies leave behind something far heavier than unanswered questions. They leave behind a warning. The Peterson case shocked America not only because of the crime itself, but because of what it revealed about the fragile nature of trust. To those who knew them, Scott and Laci appeared to live an ordinary life. They were a young couple preparing for their first child. They celebrated holidays with family. They planned a future together. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. And that is what made the case so deeply unsettling. Because the danger did not appear in the form of a stranger. It appeared in a place people rarely expected. Inside the home. Inside a marriage. Inside a life that looked perfectly normal. For investigators who worked the case, the experience left a lasting impression. Many later reflected on how quickly a routine missing person call had turned into one of the most disturbing investigations of their careers. They had entered a quiet neighborhood expecting to search for a missing woman. Instead, they uncovered a story that would haunt the country for years. And for Laci's family, the loss never truly fades. Every holiday season carries a quiet reminder of the life that should have been lived. A daughter. A mother. A child who never had the chance to be born. But perhaps the most troubling lesson from the Peterson case is not simply what happened. It is the realization that some of the most devastating tragedies unfold behind closed doors, hidden beneath the appearance of normal life. The story forces people to confront a difficult truth. Sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones no one sees coming. Neighbors did not suspect anything. Friends did not see warning signs. Even those closest to the couple struggled to reconcile the life they thought they knew with the reality that investigators eventually uncovered. And that realization, that an ordinary life can hide extraordinary darkness, is what continues to trouble many people who revisit the case today. Because the Peterson story is not just about a crime. It is about how easily trust can be broken. How quickly certainty can disappear. And how a single moment can permanently change the lives of countless people. Today, the house on Covina Avenue looks quiet again. Cars pass by. New families move through the neighborhood. Life continues, as it always does. But the memory of what happened there remains. A reminder that behind some doors, stories unfold that no one could have imagined. And that sometimes the most unsettling part of a tragedy is not just the crime itself, but the uncomfortable realization that it could happen anywhere.